Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the best albums and songs thus far in 2022. Okay, full disclosure, this list feels kind of weird. Not that it's not representative of how I feel right now and the 100+ projects I've covered, but more that it feels like there's been more that I just haven't had the chance to get to. At last count, there's at least 20 projects on that backlog. Now, part of this is inevitable. I can't get to everything. I've got caveats attached to the mid-year list every time I've made it. More than anything, it's a snapshot, and given that I've covered a little bit less overall this year, I'm still pretty confident in my picks, given that they've all had a lot of time to really sit with me. But between phasing out scores altogether and moving more towards the short form format, except when I don't and the album reviews wind up as the longest as I put out to date, I feel like things might be unpredictable this time around, and once again, no guarantee how it's all going to fall out in 6 months' time. Granted, maybe some of this feels more weird because my expectations have been continuously challenged and uprooted in 2022, for both better and for worse, and I don't think I'm alone in that regard, as I've heard a lot of folks call this as a pretty bad year for music. I would push back on that. The mainstream charts are pretty rough in 2022, and I would argue outside of isolated songs, pop has kind of struggled, but venture even a step outside and you'll find a wealth of indie music, a solid diversity of underground hip-hop, and even a nice turnaround for some heavier music, metal or otherwise. And that's not even to touch on country, which might be having one of its best years in recent memory, mainstream or indie, where there's a solid 6 projects that would be contenders for this list that I just haven't had a chance to properly cover yet. Initially, I was prepared to call this a bad year, but I really can't. It just feels kind of different, pushing you outside your comfort zone as it did for me, and that's a good thing. But I did have enough albums to flesh out a top 15, and I still had to make some major cuts. So let's start with number 15. Of all the albums to make this list, this might be one of the most surprising and strange. I certainly wouldn't have predicted it for my own list, but there is something about it that bends around peculiar times and spaces. This is an album set in multiple places in time. In the now, with its experimental blur of Celtic folk, post-industrial, and ambient, conceptually set in the future and how it constantly tests a flow of energy between tension and release, where the steps off balance can be then come prevented and set right, but also nowhere in particular, because while I can pin down influences spanning from Enya to throbbing gristle, I'm not sure I could really effectively place this album in any era. Yes, it's less structured than previous Kelly Lee Owen albums. It forces you to engage with its immaculately produced, pulsating weirdness, and while I could rave about how some of these beats are some of the best mixed in electronic music this year, the entire project is a curveball that hit me regardless. Definitely weird, and one that's been kinda slept on, but if anything I've described here sounds intriguing, it's worth your time. Also, for those who are curious, it sounds incredible on vinyl. Just a friendly tip. Number 14. And speaking of albums that don't seem to slot into a specific space or time, I've had a bit of an arc with this project. A band left in the lurch after the release and the frontman's departure with a project that's even more dense and theatrical than their first. And for as much as I loved it, it's a tricky one to place. It kind of comes and goes in waves. So while it might be a little bit lower than you'd expect, that could all change in 6 months. Hell, I'd probably guarantee that.
She had Billie Eilish style, moving to Berlin for a little while, trying to find something to hold on to.
Black Country New Road's sophomore album is paradoxical in so many ways. It's more complex and warped than their debut, but also contains their most direct hooks and easiest song structures to date. It could easily enmesh itself in manic complexity, but there's this plain-spoken, painfully earnest, and unequivocally nerdy side that flies in the face of any cooler pop-punk or experimental rock abstraction. And whether it's the settled relationship in flux or meta-commentary on former front frontman Isaac Wood's impending departure from the group. It's this glorious genre pileup that's a little bit Slint, a little bit Arcade Fire, and even a little bit Broadway. It's utterly demented with layers to spare. The critics are all over this. I honestly can't blame them one bit. Great album. Number 13. And speaking of the critics, they aren't all over this one. And yet in one of those years where it feels like they've been searching for great post-punk, they really should be.
Who had a job worth something when they're not banging on?
So Silverbacks was a Bandcamp find for me, and an absolutely great one, taking a distinctly Ernish Irish flavor to its post-punk with both the male and the female vocals to supplement the rich grooves and, let's call it, oblique writing, fitting somewhere between Gang of Four and Pavement, but also willing to embrace more earnest melody than both those acts would ever do. It's also one of the few albums in this genre that bothers to be both fun and funny, with a darker sense of humor splitting workaday class consciousness with Gen Z frustrations, to jab at petty trophies, but still get why they matter. There's a lot of empathy here. It's endlessly charming, despite playing kind of low-key. If you found a lot of post-punk this year to be a little too derivative or dour, this is a nice shot from the archive. Absolutely worth hearing. But before we go any further, let's shout out a couple songs from albums that will not be making this list, but are pretty special and worth some attention all the same, from Dawn FM, Out of Time by The Weeknd.
Say I'm there for you, but I'm out of time. Say that I care for you, but I'm out of time.
From Fix Yourself, Not the World, People Don't Change People, Time Does by the Wombats.
Time does. People don't change people. Time does.
From Rainbow Road, Life is Glorious by Second in Command.
I suppose if life is glorious, I'll try to have some fun.
From Laurel Hell, The Only Heartbreaker by Mitski. From Lucifer on the Sofa, The Hardest Cut by Spoon.
Here it come now, here it is, the hardest cut.
And from Once Twice Melody, Another Go Around by Beach House.
Another go around and you're right here.
Alright, back to the list. Number 12. Okay, I was hesitant to put this here because I'm not sure it's this band's best like the running narrative has been. It certainly doesn't have my favorite songs from them, and I find some of the flaws increasingly obvious. But when you get a considerable step forward in writing and you pile up enough bangers... The funny thing with Dance Fever is that while it has some of Florence Welch's sharpest writing and biggest hooks to date, alongside a welcome moral ambiguity in its femininity that makes the framing considerably more interesting, I still think there are more steps this band could take in order to expand their sound. Jack Antonoff on production certainly left enough space in the mixes for more melodic interplay. It could have been more interesting. That's probably why I'm a little hesitant to call this their best, but it's kind of hard for me to disagree with those who say it is. It's an album meeting all the ugly moments of 2022 in stride, throwing haymakers every step of the way. Not as deep or complex as some of its influences, but a swing for populism will make it work in spades. Anthemic with a lot of feverish intensity, this is an album that feels needed right now. Also kicks a lot of ass. If you've been waiting for an opportunity to get on board, I think there's room for you. Number 11. And you know, while we're on the topic of morally ambiguous, complicated framing...
I was dreaming of a
It's levels, it's layers, so pray for the players. We hollowed the walls and back up bodegas. I got plenty, it's so many, yeah. They say gimme, he got plenty, yeah.
There's something serpentine about this album. How Pusha T bends around a jagged tapestry of samples and grainy, nasty production where there's plenty of venom to go around, but he's choosing his targets. If you don't bother a snake, he's got no reason to bite, especially as he assesses his family legacy and traces his next steps in the world, increasingly existing among horrors to which he's always found commonplace. That's not saying this project isn't flawed. A few production choices and guest appearances don't quite resonate as strongly for me, and Pusha T has set the bar so high with Darkest Before Dawn and Daytona and his solo work that inevitably some comparisons might fall short, especially as this album doesn't quite have that same sense of immediacy. But it also wound up as one of my go-to projects when weightlifting, pardon the pun, and for that, it's incredibly good. Great stuff. Number 10. The funny thing with some country albums is that they pull you into a different specific place or time, where the setting is so fully realized that you gotta respect the atmosphere, and hell, there's gonna be an album like that on this list. But then there's the ones that simply paint a picture around a place that we might already be in, and wow, with this as my introduction to her, Jenny Tolman delivered.
Hanging on to hatred is serious business. The sweetest revenge is forgiveness.
Now on the surface, this is just ridiculously sharp, neo-traditional country music from a writer and performer who reminds me of a slightly more adult Casey Musgraves in her sultry delivery and some of the subject matter, but go a little bit deeper and you'll find a songwriter who doesn't just have a savvy eye for homespun detail that merges with the modern world remarkably well, and some sardonic commentary that digs into the crevices of the humans operating within those systems, which honestly rings as kind of insightful, but also an emotive richness that gives her honky tonk approach so much character. It reminds me in the best ways of Brandy Clark or maybe the Pistol Annies, perhaps a little less rough around the edges, but that's because Tolman would rather give you a warm smile with her freshly baked cupcake infused with cyanide instead of a shotgun blast to the face. Balanced out with so much warmth and a lot of genuine humor, Jenny Tolman is the sort of indie country starlet that deserves so much more attention. Please check this out. It's special. But before we go on, here's a couple more songs from albums that will not be making this list, still worth highlighting. From Love Sucks, Bite Me by Avril Lavigne.
You don't get it twice. And we'll be together never, so baby, you can bite me.
From Crash, New Shapes by Charlie XCX featuring Christine and the Queens and Carolyn Polachek.
What you want? I ain't got it.
From Sometimes Why, Hole in My Head by Shooter Jennings and Yellow Wolf.
I just lean against the wall with this hole inside my head.
From Oxy Music, Best Life by Alex Cameron.
Really just not for some people. I'm sick of following these rules, baby, and I'm wondering why.
From Ethiops, Remorseless by Billy Woods.
Nebuchadnezzar, this world hard to even take its measure. 3 rooms filled with ink and treasure, still strangle the king, cause it's now or never.
And from Diaspora Problems, Spiritual Level of Gang Shit by Soul Glow featuring McKinley Dixon and Ioji. And now, back to the list. Number 9. Okay, look, in 2020, when this artist flipped every script on his career with the sort of make-or-break artistic statement that put him in a different class, I thought the relative commercial failure of it in comparison with his previous run of actual hits might have screwed him over. At the very least, he'd probably go back to what Music Row wanted, play it safe. It's not like critical acclaim pays the bills. Instead, he doubled down, and we got this.
So get out of mind. Take your heart with you. And all those things that will never mind anyway.
Brett Eldredge's new album is so endlessly fun, it's kind of hard for me to turn away. Part of it is the sheer audacity for him to keep going into country soul with infectious charisma and production that kept a lot of the showmanship, but that would also ignore how he delivered an album with a lot of dimensionality and varied character. Yeah, the humor and heartfelt charm, that wasn't going away, but I was shocked how many songs actually had some teeth this time, willing to let him play his songs with a little bit more moral complexity, not always being the nice guy. Again, I don't think his label has the slightest clue as to what to do with this, and in all due fairness, it doesn't have the knockout punch like Sunday Drive, which was my favorite song of 2020, but you know what? He's gonna deliver an entire set of songs about you. You could do a hell of a lot worse. Another project that's getting slept on, y'all should fix that. Number 8. So this is more of a mixtape than a proper album. Normally that would mean it would slip out of my view pretty quickly, as it seems like it has for a lot of critics to my surprise. I'm gonna push back a little against it. It might be her most accessible or conventional project to date, but at least for me, it stuck the most.
I could be with anyone. I'm pussy like a pussycat. You're the only one I want. Give love and then you take it back. All the kisses, all the fun. I hate it when you give me half. Never give me half.
This was the first truly great project from 2022, at least to me, and FKA Twigs proved that by playing to rougher, lower stakes, she could not only sound more comfortable, but also deliver a lot of the textured, varied R&B that might not take all the same experimental chances, but had more hooks and a different kind of depth. Her previous projects might feel more studied, classically artistic, more to be watched and admired from a distance, even as she put forward some soul-rending humanity, but Caprisongs is FKA Twigs that are most relatable and flavorful, where the stakes might be more intimate as she tries to trace an arc of self-possessed mindfulness, but I was honestly surprised how well it translated and aged 6 months later, where the ramshackle textures are just a natural fit for the summer, proving that healing kind of works in all seasons. You might have lost touch with this one over the past half of a year. It's worth the reconnection. Great stuff. Number 7. Okay, the next 2 projects on this list might be considered controversial, probably because this is one, more than most, is the most obviously flawed, but understandably so. While many pandemic albums have been slow-burning meditations that run long and slowly parse out a lot of their introspection, this is more of a midlife crisis slammed down on wax, and it's the best thing Frank Turner has made in over a decade.
Don't you ever wake up and suspect that you were simply never cut out to be the kind of person they expect, the person you intended to be.
But yeah, not a comfortable listen. And I say that with the expectation that it's hardcore punk. It's not supposed to be comfortable. No. This is mid-therapy session breakdown, where you're seeing Frank Turner at his most naked and ugly and unlikable, where lockdown forced him to fight buried demons from his childhood, his distant father, now a trans woman, and a rather tenuous relationship with those online playing purity politics, with a complicated punk who has had a messy relationship with the left since the 2000s. So yeah, it's a midlife crisis. Frank Turner's lashing out, often uncomfortably, and yet when paired with his most abrasive production in years, his best hooks in years, and writing that's often so unbearably honest and with more than a few direct sequel moments to his best album, Love Iron Song, there's a raw firepower that gets me every single time. There's a lot of good intentions here, and bad intentions, but framed properly, because man, he knows it. And if he wants to just let loose a torrent of bile at the hypocritical pedants and keyboard warriors who would never dare expose anything real about themselves, yeah, I can empathize. A lot. I don't have expectations this is going to lead to a second win for him. This feels like something that Frank Turner just really needs to get out of his system at his darkest moment. But fuck, this hit when it needed. But we're over halfway through here. Let's go through a couple more songs from albums that are not on this list. From the Josh Ramsey Show, You and I by Josh Ramsey featuring Fian.
You're the answer with only you and I.
From Familia, Psycho Freak by Camila Cabello featuring Willow.
Tell me that you love me, are you lying? Give me lemonade, I give you limes.
From True North, Mary Oliver by Carolyn Spence.
Never did figure it out. I sit down here to work through my
From 5 Seconds Flat, Doomsday by Lizzie McAlpine.
I don't get a choice in the matter. Why would I? It's only the death of me.
From Two Ribbons, Insect Loop by Let's Eat Grandma. And from Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, Rich Spirit by Kendrick Lamar.
You know more, I'm fasting, bitch, I'm attractive. Can't fuck with you no more, I'm fasting,
Okay, let's get back into the list. Number 6. And here's the second one. And while I said it might be controversial, it's less because of the album's content and more because it's been getting a really weird critical reception. It's divided a lot of folks. Some think it's the most slapdash, stupid pop concession that this art rock band has ever made, whereas I think it might just be their best album. Yeah, dead serious.
I said, hey, do you think you got everyone under your control? When you haven't got anyone at all.
If you had told me in the past 9 years that an Everything album would be this high on one of my lists, I probably would have called you crazy. This is a band I always respected more than I actually liked. I never thought I'd be able to get over Jonathan Higgs's interesting voice, let alone the band's wonky relationships with grooves or melody. But maybe it took the art pop alternative dance flourish for Everything to really click for me. But yeah, they did. Stacking terrific synth work, propulsive grooves to the ceiling as they weave a tangled hall of mirrors and AI co-written lyrics to conceal the deeply held trauma. It's frequently absurd, but hell, if you spend enough time on the warped corners of the internet, that should be no surprise. We're all deflecting out here. I think that's what gives the album so much staying power and emotional clarity to me. It's a particularly nerdy and warped strain of pop culture rammed through this band's weird eccentricities. The album in 1975 have been trying to make for years and have been failing. But unlike previous projects, there is a vulnerable core of humanity that comes forth amidst the jumble. And hell, having some of their best hooks of the year thus far, that can't hurt either. I don't think you're going to hear much else like this in 2022. I cannot guarantee it's going to work for you, even as a fan of Everything, but if it does, you're in for something special. Number 5. The tricky thing when you're following a landmark debut is following it up, especially when you swap out your critically adored producer with someone with fewer credits to their name. But at the end of the day, fantastic songwriting and a powerful central presence will carry you over, and in a banner year for country, Iano did it again.
And all these roads could have swore that they closed, and all these towns would have swore they fell down.
So no, it's not as dark or visceral as Between the Country, but in a funny way, I've kind of stopped minding that with this album. There's more emotional diversity, a greater sense of empathy surrounding the characters of these stories amidst the passage of time that's set to trample them underfoot, from the coal mines to the backwoods. There isn't much hope to be found amidst the rivers or mountains of Appalachia, as fellow writers like Cole Chaney and Pony Bradshaw, or even Tyler Childers might mention in their music, but Iano paints their drive to live and cling to sanity with the sort of detail that it's hard not to empathize, find that humanity, be they in snapshots of melancholy, wry bits of workaday humor, or the darker edges for which he's now become known. Iano is probably the best in the scene at this point in crafting those emotionally nuanced, wide-angle shots, and dares you to find humanity therein, and he made one of the best indie country albums of this year. This one's been ignored by way too many. Y'all should hear it. Number 4. So as some of you might have realized by now, Kendrick Lamar is not on this list. And despite my 40-minute review of Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, wasn't a particularly close decision either. Parts of the album have grown on me, parts have gotten considerably worse with time, and while I mostly respect the project, I'm not going to be like some critical establishments and bend over backwards to give a pedestal to Kendrick Lamar that he doesn't even want. No, if there's a rapper who doesn't want that pedestal but might deserve it more, it's this guy.
Any day could be our last day. So much trouble on the streets that we need to buy a AK. Rock a mask for the whole day. We ain't tryna get sick, so we walk around with no face. The USA is a cold place. Cold world, we don't even got a North Face. Any day could be our last day. Drinking, I've been drinking on the AA.
And to think I was highlighting the Kendrick Lamar parallels when I reviewed the album proper. But okay, enough about that. This is easily my favorite rap album of 2022 thus far, and it deserves all the acclaim in the world for it. Leaping across subgenres spanning boom bap, trap, breakbeat, and some more experimental textures, Denzel Curry finally took that added step to infuse his writing with the challenging depth that was always lurking behind his bangers and now is fully on display, with hooks for days and his own confrontation with being a leader in the modern rap game. Less as the aspirational hero crushed by his morality, more like the anti-hero who has always been on that edge of unstable darkness and knows the grim cost of walking that lonely road. Coupled with his most lush and liquid production to date, stellar guest performances, impeccable flow between songs and in his bars alike, I think this is Denzel Curry's best work to date. Let's give him a little bit more of that acclaim. There's plenty to go around. And yes, we are almost at the end here, but before we finish this off, a couple more songs from albums that did not make the cut. From Death fame, Alive Ain't Always Living by Quelle Chris.
Alive ain't always living, sometimes niggas just survive day to day. Plate to plate, 2 piece and fries, or the steak with leaves on sides, sometimes low and sometimes high.
From Farm to Table, Heavy Heart by Bartees Strain. From Ghostlight, Sounds of Yesterday by Poets of the Fall. From Crunkstar, Falling Off by Duke Deuce featuring Rico Nasty.
Some poppy shit off, oh poppy shit off. I got the ice and the money to drip. Bitch, I'm a boss, bitch, I'm a boss. Bitch, I'm the king of crunk, so it ain't no falling off.
From Closure, continuation of The New Day by Porcupine Tree.
Live again on the new day.
And from Drill Music in Zion, Miss Mural by Lupe Fiasco.
Painter said the blues. Do you act off intuition or languish and peruse? More like tap into tradition from the angle of my mood.
Now let's finish this off. Number 3. The last couple projects on this list, they all floored me on first listen. This one probably most of all because I didn't see it coming. In my review of the album, I described how some sloppy, underthought comments did this project a massive disservice before going in, and somehow they keep on popping up. But if I have to be the one advocate at the pulpit for this, let's make my case. If this wasn't her full-length debut, I'd be tempted to call it a magnum opus, a generational epic, melodrama ramped to heaven and hell and back, and content that brings up all the moral ambiguity of American idealism, disembowels it, and then feeds on the entrails. And all of that would be too much, especially stretched over 90 minutes, if Ethel Cain wasn't insanely gifted in producing such a textured, visceral world, first through a lot of gorgeous production and masterful command of melody and groove, but also how she integrates more beyond just slowcore and baroque instrumentation, and even some anthemic Americana moments that could go for broke alongside anything else this year. It's awe-inspiring how much she was able to deliver this on her own. And well, to many, it'll all still be way too much. I'll use the lingua ignota comparison when it comes to some graphic content that's just as applicable. In the United States, which is seeing more hideous shades of white Christian theocracy and hypocrisy, this album's true heavenly resonance burns all the hotter. Number 2. Alright, full disclosure, between this album and Ethel Cain, basically a toss-up. A borderline tie when it came to the music. They both struck such a deep chord for me, and in ways I was not expecting this year. The only reason I'm placing this slightly higher is because Preacher's Daughter, for all of its grandeur, can be tough to revisit just in one sitting. It's a lot. You need to be prepared for it. Whereas this, I'll play it anytime.
Oh, out of time. Oh, I'm out of time.
The fact that Orville Peck took such a leap with Bronco this year just makes me feel overjoyed. And the fact that my favorite karaoke DJ has about half the songs from this album available already because Orville Peck's Canadian is all the more wonderful. But I'd actually argue it goes further. Orville Peck took a real leap as a performer and moving beyond some of his obvious inspirations to showcase one of the most uniquely powerful voices in indie country right now. And his instrumentation and production got so much more warmer and more varied and groove driven, which has prompted a lot of folks to brand him as less country to get around covering the genre, or on the other side to dismiss his country credentials. And yet I would argue there's so many different shades of that genre, I don't know how you can even do that in good faith. Until you realize it's not being done in good faith. Yes, it's a little bit less gothic, but Orville Peck is aiming bigger now, and with the songwriting getting sharper and more focused in queer storytelling, just so much more confident, to say nothing of so many catchy standouts, it's hard for me to complain. It's everything I could have wanted but never expected from Orville Peck. And while he might have been a bit of a curiosity to me before, now he's a force to be reckoned with, and deservingly so. This kicks so much ass. And finally, number 1. The caveat I make with this choice is that in a different world where I actually reviewed its predecessor, I'm not sure I would have been as high on it, because I necessarily would have been making comparisons, and that album is an unsung classic of 2010's indie rock that for some reason I missed in 2017. But I also can't deny that even if I would look more harshly on this in contrast, still the best project I heard all damn year.
Come find me. I'm here today but don't belong. I'm working till the dead is gone. The upside of it, the upside of it.
Discovering Gang of Youths properly in 2022 has been one of the biggest highlights of my year. Not just Go Further and Lightness, but also Angel in Real Time, the Octung Baby to that album's Joshua Tree. But even that comparison does not do this project justice. For one, I don't really care for Octung Baby, because you can easily make the U2 parallel. This is not an album that embraces irony beyond just one moment, rightfully taking the piss out of a music industry demanding trauma be commodified. No. When Gang of Youths embrace textures from the South Pacific or breakbeats from the UK, they're doing it in the service of the global story, the world they're fashioning, telling the story of a lost father where the complicated epic of his life deserves those wide-angle shots and emotional stakes that are flung to the rafters. And I could go on about how the album is stacked to the brim with some of the best hooks you'll hear in indie rock, or how despite the album's length it never flags in its momentum, or how flat-out gorgeous this production is, or how Dave LaPepe is a frontman who can split the difference between Matt Berninger and Bono and somehow ring out the best of both, or how The Kingdom Is Within You might just be my runaway pick for my favorite song of 2022, and we still have 6 months to go. But if I want an album that can fill any voice at any time for damn near any mood, Angel in Real Time is my answer. An album that makes you feel huge within a world that's even larger for it. Best album thus far in 2022? If anything comes close to this year, we'll have something special indeed. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. Just to give you a bit of a channel update before we go on, yes, I know there's been a lot more shorts, or maybe you don't know because, again, they don't actually send out YouTube notifications for shorts. The bell doesn't really help there. But what I have been doing is I've been compiling them into traditional On The Pulse episodes that you can still watch if you're interested. Again, I kind of hope you check out the shorts. They're actually doing kind of well, and they're actually a structure of writing that I really appreciate. I'm probably going to do more of them going forward, just simply because it opens up my timing so much more effectively, but hey, just to keep you guys in the loop of what's going to go on going forward. But if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in helping support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. It's tough times. Believe me, I get it. I'll be alright, but if you want to, options are available. Till then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.